Welcome to where time falls quiet.
The day Earth hit reset the Younger Dryas mystery. Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. What if the story of human civilization did not begin in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, but in the silence that followed a cataclysm? Imagine for a moment that everything we call progress, the architecture, the mathematics, the written word, was not a beginning but a careful restoration. It is an unsettling thought, but one that increasingly whispers through the strata of our planet, through fractured stones and sedimentary scars that remember better than we do. Beneath the layers of dust and denial, there is another chronology, one written not by victors, but by survivors. 12,000 years ago, the Earth shifted violently. Something immense ruptured the climate, shattering a world of warmth and abundance into one of ice and silence. Geologists call it the end of the Younger Dryas, a name that disguises the violence behind bureaucratic precision. But among the rocks, the story is not calm. Nano-diamonds, meltglass, and iridium layers tell of impact and fire, of continents scoured by sudden heat. The Earth itself still carries the burn marks. What if that moment was not simply the end of an age, but the reset of one? Civilization, as we are told, began only after the ice retreated, when fields softened and cities bloomed. But what if those cities were not inventions? What if they were memorials, echoes of something humanity once remembered with precision? The myths that survived the flood speak of gods, of teachers, of structures lifted before the waters rose. Ancient lists from Sumer to Egypt claim dynasties that ruled for tens of thousands of years before the first recorded king. Historians call it exaggeration, yet their refusal to forget suggests that exaggeration was, perhaps, all that survived of a deeper truth. Imagine the first archaeologists unearthing clay tablets under the desert's heat, not realizing that those fragile slabs of baked earth were the voice of a world, remembering another world. They catalogued their findings by layer, by stratum, assuming order grew upward. But archaeology, when inverted, becomes something else, an act of resurrection. Beneath the earliest cities lie not wild camps or caves, but fragments of geometry, patterns too deliberate to belong to randomness. The sand may have concealed the ruins, but the proportions whisper continuity. The phrase, "the world before memory," is both poetic and geological. It describes that stretch of human existence erased not by time, but by trauma. After the Younger Dryas event, languages fractured, tools vanished, and the surface of the planet reshaped itself. What was once city or temple became ridge and stone. Yet in the myths of every surviving culture there exists a shared wound, a memory of loss, flood, and the return of light. That shared memory does not belong to invention, it belongs to inheritance. But if inheritance existed, how much was lost? Imagine the totality of human knowledge melted down in a single night of sky fire and ocean surge. The survivors would not rebuild, they would wander. They would carry symbols, not blueprints. They would repeat sounds whose meaning they no longer knew, prayers becoming alphabets by accident. The first carved stones after the flood were not experiments in strength, they were experiments in memory. To carve was to remember the shape of what had been erased. All around the world, from the Andes to Anatolia, there exist sites that seem anachronistic, born too early, too perfect. Göbekli Tepe, for example, emerges from the dust of Turkey's high plains with monoliths engraved in relief, aligned to the stars of another epoch. Its builders appear suddenly, fully formed, their architecture mathematical, their vision cosmic. Archaeologists once insisted they were hunter-gatherers discovering complexity. But the perfection of Göbekli Tepe is not discovery. It's recall. The site itself is buried intentionally, as if to preserve a code too dangerous or sacred to leave exposed. In that act of burial there is a strange awareness, an understanding that memory itself might need to be hidden, to be saved. The flood myths describe not merely destruction, but concealment. Knowledge goes underground. The mountain ark, the sealed tablet, the submerged temple, they are metaphors of the same act, storage through cataclysm. Archaeology often confuses absence with origin. It assumes that because no earlier evidence is visible, nothing existed before. But absence is not emptiness. Absence is a layer deeper than our current reach. Now, let us descend into that silence. Imagine the world at the precise moment the ice began to retreat. The air is thick with silt and ash. The coasts are unrecognizable. Mammoths perish, forests rot beneath the new torrents, and humanity is reduced to fragments. Clusters of survivors staring at skies still trembling from impact. Yet in these shattered landscapes, seeds of memory persist. They trace constellations just as their ancestors had done, perhaps not knowing why the sky felt like home. The first civilizations were not builders in the modern sense. They were restorers of lost patterns. Consider the mathematics of Sumer. Its sexagesimal system, based on 60, is not an arbitrary choice. It mirrors celestial cycles with unnerving precision, the precession of equinoxes, lunar synods, and planetary conjunctions. These are not peasant observations. They are relics of an intellectual continuity that should not have existed. Every schoolchild learns that civilization advances gradually, but the archaeological record shows the opposite, a sudden surge of literacy, architecture, and astronomy appearing fully coherent. No apprenticeship, no adolescence, just the abrupt arrival of complexity. Academia explains this as a threshold effect. The truth may be more uncomfortable. What if they did not learn but recover? Every flood erases the library, but not the librarians. The next generation writes from fragmented recollection, from calculation without context. Even their gods are mnemonic devices, names attached to principles they no longer understand. When the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, they were not inventing celestial overseers. They were trying, desperately, to describe those who came before the waters. It is tempting to view these connections as romantic speculation, yet the physical evidence accumulates like silt in a delta. Submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Caribbean suggest occupations before sea levels stabilized. Glacial melt raised oceans by more than 100 meters in mere centuries, a geological blink capable of consuming entire cities. The myth of the flood, repeated across every continent, becomes less a moral parable and more a geological memoir. The earth remembers in its layers what humanity enshrined in story. Imagine standing before one of those submerged structures, the stone covered in coral and silence. Each block, each groove, feels deliberate, measured. Your fingertips trace geometry meant for another sky, a sky where the stars have not yet shifted their positions by precession. The alignment is no longer perfect, but the intent remains. It is as if the builders carved their farewell in angles and ratios, hoping someone someday would hear them through the noise of sediment and disbelief. The ocean floor is not graveyard, it is archive. The disquiet grows when one realizes how perfectly the myths map onto that archive. The Popol Vuh of the Maya speaks of earlier creations destroyed by flood and fire. The Ziusudra epic in Sumeria recounts a similar purge, dated suspiciously close to the Younger Dryas boundary. Even Plato's account of Atlantis, so often mocked, matches the timeline within a margin of geological plausibility. The myth-makers of antiquity were not fabricating fantasy, they were encoding catastrophe. And somewhere inside that encrypted memory lies the ghost of a civilization erased. The very phrase, "the Great Reset," belongs not to conspiracy, but to geology. The Earth has performed it many times. Fire, ice, impact, flood, each a system reboot, each a loss of continuity. What distinguishes the Younger Dryas reset is that humanity stood at a threshold, intelligent enough to remember, but fragile enough to forget. Out of that contradiction rises the strange symmetry of our history. We are endlessly rediscovering what we once already knew. We call it progress because we cannot accept the alternative, that we are reassembling fragments of memory. If this is true, then everything we build today is haunted. Our technologies, our maps, our languages, they all bear residues of patterns far older than their supposed origins. The sequence of 60 in timekeeping, the orientation of north-south in sacred architecture, the circular cosmologies repeated across continents, all point backward, not forward. When one listens carefully, the hum of the present begins to echo with the voice of the past. Civilization, that proud monolith, is built upon the silence of something it cannot name. To look at the ruins of our ancestors is to confront that silence. Each eroded line on a megalith, each symbol pressed into clay, contains more than artistic impulse. It holds the residue of a survival instinct. Writing began as accounting, yes, but deeper still it was accounting for loss. The loss of certainty, the loss of context, the loss of memory. When we read the oldest tablets, we are not hearing the beginning of culture. We are overhearing recovery. They were rebuilding their world with the tools of a vocabulary that had not yet caught up with grief. In the whispering darkness of museums and archives, the ghosts of that recovery still murmur. Archaeologists classify, dust, and number. But the act feels like reconstructing a shattered mirror. You can piece together the shards, but what returns is not the same reflection. What if understanding our true past means accepting that most of it is missing? Knowledge, after all, is not only about accumulation, but remembrance. And remembrance, when stretched too far from its origin, becomes myth. The world before memory does not accuse or reassure, it simply waits. It waits beneath the ice, beneath the rhetoric of beginnings, beneath the hubris of thinking we are the first. It breathed through the cracks of history, through the symmetry of pyramids, through the precise irrationality of legends that repeat themselves across unrelated tongues. And it whispers the same warning across aeons. Nothing built by humanity is immune to forgetting. Every stone, every equation, every name carved into bronze will one day be sediment again. The arc of civilization does not end, it restarts. So, if the flood once came not to punish, but to purge, what does it mean when we find ourselves at the brink once more? The glaciers melt again, the climate trembles, the patterns repeat. But unlike those who came before, we carry instruments, satellites, and archives capable of remembering far longer than myth. And still, perhaps, we will fail to listen. Because the lesson of 12,000 years ago is not about survival, it is about humility. The earth does not end us in rage, it resets us in silence. The question is whether we can remember loudly enough to break that cycle. There are moments in planetary history that do not announce themselves with fire or thunder, but with an almost unfathomable stillness. 12 millennia ago, Earth entered one of these intervals of silence, a sudden return to glacial cold after the world had begun to thaw. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, a name as lifeless as the ice it describes, its syllables incapable of expressing the violence encoded in those frozen layers. Yet the evidence is clear, an anomaly so abrupt that no slow climate mechanism, no gradual orbit shift can account for it. Something enormous intervened. Picture a world balancing delicately on the edge of warmth. The mammoths and mastodons of the plains still roamed vast corridors of green tundra. Early humans followed them, carrying tools chipped from the memory of warmer times. And then, almost instantaneously, in the space of a few human lifetimes, the warmth collapsed. Glaciers returned, the air thickened with dust, the rivers slowed to crystal threads, the earth exhaled frost. In the geological record, this transformation is captured not as story but as chemistry, abrupt spikes in isotopic ratios, grains of shocked quartz, traces of soot embedded in ice. These are not the fingerprints of snow, they are the fingerprints of trauma. For centuries, academia treated the Younger Dryas as a statistical curiosity, a minor quirk in climate data. But beneath the frozen archives of Greenland and South America, a pattern of melted glassy droplets, carbon spherules and nano-diamonds revealed something unerasable. These are materials that form under immense heat, heat achieved only in the heart of an explosion or an extraterrestrial impact. The surface of the Earth had, for a brief instant, liquefied. Fields turned to ash, skies bled with debris, and what we now call prehistory shuddered to a halt. The silence after such violence is deceptive. It is not peace, but aftermath. We know of no written testimony from that night of fire. But the planet wrote its own confession in layers. The strata of meltglass lie over black mats rich in carbon, where megafaunal bones vanish en masse. Whole ecosystems died so completely that even the seeds of their recovery were sterilized. The distribution of these layers, across continents, aligned in time, compels the mind to imagine scale. If the cores were regional, the impact markers would not circle the globe. Yet, they do. At the close of the Pleistocene, the Earth itself recorded an event that humanity forgot. There are scientists who still resist the idea of a cosmic intruder, the so-called Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They prefer terrestrial explanations: ocean circulation, volcanic ash, solar cycles. But each alternative dissolves in the face of the data. No volcano, however fierce, leaves iridium. No subtle oceanic current carves microtectites in distant deserts. The narrative of the sky grows difficult to ignore. Somewhere above the melting glaciers of North America, an object of impossible brilliance met the atmosphere and changed everything. The energy released would have been many times greater than all of humanity's atomic experiments combined. The ice remembers. Its layers are like pages pressed together by the weight of centuries. Each band of crystalline compression holds a signature: dust levels, trapped gases, remnants of combustion. Within one such layer corresponding to this mysterious interval, the chemical story shifts abruptly. Sulfates spike, methane plummets. A planet that had been singing in the key of warmth suddenly fell an octave lower. The sound, if you could hear it, would have been a global sigh, a harmonic collapse into cold. The silence beneath that ice is not mere absence, It is the echo of something lost mid-sentence. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of one of those great ice sheets as the temperature begins to fall. At first, the change is beautiful. Horizons shimmering in crystalline hues, rivers forming mirror-like surfaces, the air so sharp it hums in the lungs. But soon, beauty becomes hunger. Forests retract, animals vanish, and the human breath itself becomes a fleeting luxury. Whole generations would have grown up never seeing green. If any memory of a golden age remained, it would have lived only in stories whispered by firelight, tales of warmth told by the cold. The myths of Eden, of lost gardens and fallen skies, may have been born here, in that long night of frost. The geological data reveal not just destruction, but pattern. Following the onset of the Younger Dryas, ice cores show 2 centuries of stable, brutal cold, followed by a rapid rewarming of similar speed. This oscillation is not natural by our gradualist standards. It is catastrophic in tempo, an environmental strobe illuminating the fragility of everything alive. Civilizations thrive on predictability. When predictability collapses, so does memory. The hunters, the builders, the dreamers, each group rewritten by necessity into survivors. The continuity of knowledge froze beneath the same glaciers that masked the craters. Across Canada, beneath layers of ancient sediment, geologists have discovered depressions long dismissed as glacial formations. Yet their geometry, circular, multi-ringed, glass-lined, betrays another origin. If impacts did occur there, they may have struck a world in mid-thaw, where immense ice sheets amplified the destruction. Vaporized water would have risen into the atmosphere in titanic volumes, generating storms beyond comprehension. Torrents of meltwater carved new rivers overnight, erasing geography as easily as history. To human eyes, it would have appeared as the wrath of heaven. It is stratigraphy under duress. What makes this silence distinct is not only that it nearly ended us, but that it may have ended something before us. The rapidity of the climatic descent hints at ecosystem disruption on a global scale, extinction, not evolution. And in the faint archaeological record just before this plunge, there are hints of settlement patterns, of craftsmanship and organization too advanced for nomads. Was there an earlier wave of culture, an Atlantic-spanning network of coastal peoples eliminated in one icy breath? Their cities would now lie hundreds of feet underwater, beyond the continental shelf where glacial seas once rested. The oceans are vast archives, and we have barely opened the cover. To peer into the isotopic data is to witness panic recorded in chemistry. Oxygen and hydrogen ratios twist wildly, signaling not stability, but turmoil. Ash from faraway volcanoes appears layered with cosmic dust, a collage of terrestrial and extraterrestrial grief. The planet does not lie, it catalogues. The scientific reports read like obituaries: biodiversity gone, forests fallen, sediments warped. The hypothesis of impact is not poetic imagination, it is the only story that aligns the evidence into coherence. The silence beneath the ice is therefore not the quiet of peace, but the holding of breath after trauma. Our ancestors endured it without comprehension. Their oral traditions became vaults for what they could not explain. Darkness at midday, fire that fell upward, snow that came in storms of ash. They encoded terror in metaphor. A serpent in the sky, a celestial wheel, the gods waging war. These myths emerge again and again in independent cultures. Each is a mnemonic device for catastrophe, a linguistic fossil of the moment when heaven itself seemed to turn against earth. Over time, myth fossilized into religion, religion into memory, memory into trembling intuition, a knowledge we still sense but no longer recognize. The scientific and the mythic meet at a strange intersection in the Younger Dryas story. Each speaks a language of evidence, one numerical, the other emotional. Yet both converge on the same realization. Something extraordinary happened 12,000 years ago. The line between them blurs when we admit that both aim to preserve truth under different states of erosion. The scientist measures iridium, the poet measures absence. Both end up describing the same layer of darkness. The silence beneath the ice is, in this way, both data and elegy. The Earth's recovery from that cold came with terrifying speed. Within decades, perhaps even years, glaciers melted at rates unseen before or since. Rivers burst their boundaries, seas rose in pulses, and continents bled fresh water into salt. Out of this chaos, new ecosystems struggled to take hold. And with them, perhaps, new societies. The thaw was not gentle. It was resurrection by flood. And as the ice surrendered its grip, it also surrendered artifacts, bones, and objects that did not belong to the later Stone Age. Traces of a humanity already sophisticated, already aware. If we listen carefully, we can still hear that ancient stillness beneath our modern noise. It hums faintly in the winds over Greenland, in the creak of Arctic shelves breaking under their own weight. The same climatic pattern that once silenced the world has begun, in faint repetition, to whisper again. Polar melt accelerates. Ocean currents tremble and methane trapped for millennia seeps once more into the air. The past does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes in minerals, currents, and clouds. The Younger Dryas was not only a beginning, it was a warning. Perhaps this explains humanity's obsession with endings. Every myth, every revelation, every prophecy of fire or flood is less prediction than memory. We dream of apocalypse because we have survived one, and the deeper digs into the glacial record, the clearer that buried memory becomes. The catastrophe was real, its evidence burned and frozen into a geological confession. Our ancestors' stories, dismissed as allegory, were reports from the front line of survival. The silence beneath the ice is their testimony, untranslated, unremembered, but indelible. In this silence, the world reset. Everything that came before dissolved into chemical anonymity. Everything that came after began with amnesia. We call that moment the rise of civilization, but perhaps it was simply the thawing of memory. The race that emerged onto warmer plains was not newborn, it was orphaned. It rebuilt with trembling hands, guided not by invention, but by echo. And beneath every temple, every legend, every dream of lost worlds, that silence still waits. The ice may melt, but memory does not. It only changes state, waiting for us to listen. When the ice began to melt, it did not melt evenly. Whole continents flooded not as tides but as avalanches, oceans turning inside out, sky weeping down upon land already drowning. Humanity did not vanish that day. It fractured. The archaeologist's trowel recovers hints of this fragmentation. Families that became tribes, tribes that became myths, scattered like seeds from a garden that no longer existed. Within these broken genealogies lurk survivors, not founders but remnants, guardians of skills so old that they could not explain them, only perform them. Imagine wandering across a planet whose geography had become unfamiliar overnight. Shorelines swallowed, mountain valleys transfigured into new lakes, the map of memory redrawn by chaos. In such a world, survival was not about strength, but recollection. The people who endured carried within them a thread of remembrance, mathematical, architectural, linguistic echoes that were no longer fully understood. When they raised a stone in alignment with the sunrise, they did not know that they were repeating celestial trigonometry. They were remembering through gesture. Geneticists tracing the migrations that followed find ghost populations, markers in mitochondrial DNA that appear, vanish, and reappear in distant continents without clear lineage. Some call these anomalies statistical noise. Others hear them as whisper of the forgotten. Imagine a small community surviving the flood on a high plateau, their language isolated, their myths intact, but context erased. For centuries they would repeat the stories of those before them, the teachers from the sky, the builders before the water, and when finally they descended to repopulate the valleys, these stories would become foundational scripture. In that transformation from survival to memory, the first civilizations gestated. They rose where survivors could gather, in floodplains rich with silt left by retreating waters, the Nile, the Indus, the Tigris. But their myths are older than those rivers. The Sumerian king lists do not begin at the founding of Uruk or Kish. They begin before the flood. The pre-Diluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, an absurdity unless time itself had been measured differently. Their reigns might encode astronomical cycles, fragments of pre-cataclysmic observation converted into narrative. The survivors did not invent chronology, they translated it. Consider the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero. Unlike later reinterpretations, he is not a moral archetype punished for hubris, but a man entrusted with preservation. The gods warn him not out of affection but necessity. They fear forgetting. His ark is not salvation, it is archive. Across continents, this motif repeats. Utnapishtim, Noah, Deucalion, Manu. The names change, but their cargo remains the same. Memory encapsulated in myth. Each survives to teach the subsequent world how to measure, how to record, how to rebuild what was once lost. It is as if the flood myth was humanity's first instruction manual for civilizational reboot. If this sounds poetic, look again at the evidence. Around the same epoch, cultures independent by oceans begin sudden leaps forward. In southeastern Anatolia, megaliths emerge. In Peru, monumental terraces appear. In Egypt's pre-dynastic sites, precise stone cutting begins centuries too early. The archaeologist's term for this is cultural convergence, but the phenomenon is better understood as inheritance manifesting unevenly. Each remnant group uncoiled fragments of the same long-buried pattern, reinventing it piecemeal. Civilization, then, may be less invention than distributed recollection, like a language relearned from scattered syllables. Languages themselves bear witness to this dispersal. Comparative linguistics reveals root words for concepts such as water, star, and measurement shared across ancient tongues with no known contact. These were not coincidences, they were survival terminology, preserved because they held the key to sustenance and navigation. When the flood erased boundaries, language became arc. Spoken by refugees across deserts and mountains, each word was a fossil of continuity. The survivors could not read the stars as their predecessors did, but they could name them, and in naming, they remembered. Anthropologists find parallel rituals that mirror this mnemonic instinct. The act of orienting temples toward the equinox, the repetition of circular stone rings, the sacred numbering in multiples of 60, all are acts of remembrance. These survivors coded mathematics inside faith, so that devotion itself became an act of storage. Perhaps they knew that stone endures longer than speech. By embedding knowledge in structure, they ensured that even if understanding faded, pattern would persist. The temple was a textbook written in geometry. The survivors of the deluge walked with contradictions. They were keepers of vast knowledge and victims of total amnesia. Every tool they made carried the ghost of absent teachers. Every song they sang was in a dialect half extinct. To survive was to rewrite tradition under duress. But that very rewriting became sacred. The loss itself was mythologized. A fallen sky, a drowned world, gods retreating westward. The imagery unites shamans from Siberia with poets of Sumer, priests of Egypt, and sages of Mesoamerica. It is the same trauma told in different tongues. There is reason to believe they recognized their role as receivers rather than originators. In Sumerian and Akkadian inscriptions, the phrase, "those who came before," recurs with reverence. Egyptian priests spoke of ancestors who possessed wisdom from the time when the stars had not yet shifted. Even the Greeks at the dawn of recorded philosophy positioned their wisdom as derivative, a gift from the Nile or from the East. The survivors were humble because they knew their mastery was borrowed. Their brilliance was recovery disguised as genius. Archaeological anomalies make more sense under this interpretation. How could early Neolithic communities measure solstices with sub-arc-minute accuracy? How could they quarry and align stones weighing hundreds of tons while lacking metallurgy? The answer need not be extraterrestrial. It is mnemonic. They were following preserved procedures whose origins they no longer understood. Ritual replaced comprehension. The priest became the engineer, reciting formulae that once described astronomical constants, but now served as chants for the divine. The ritual still produced precision, even after its logic was forgotten. In every myth of the flood, there is a moment after the waters recede when the survivor looks upon a desolate landscape and is instructed to begin again. It is not a joyous command. It is a burden, the task of reassembling the past from fragments without context. The survivors must decide what to preserve and what to discard, a decision that shapes millennia. Imagine rebuilding a machine after losing the manual, guided only by intuition and inherited reverence. You would prioritize the sacred over the functional, artistry over understanding. That is exactly what they did. The ancient sages who engraved the earliest symbols were not inventing writing. They were creating memory anchors. Carving was a way to resist the instability of the spoken word, which had betrayed them during the chaos. Over time, these pictographs evolved into accounting, but their origin was funerary, a desperate attempt to preserve remembrance. The inscriptions at early sites are often not inventories of grain, but of stars, floods, and ancestors. Writing began then, not as commerce, but commemoration. It memorialized loss rather than wealth. Across the centuries that followed, these survivor cultures slowly reconstituted stability. As generations passed, the trauma of the flood transformed into religion, and religion into order. Laws arose, architecture grew monumental, and time itself became linear again. But beneath every triumph, an unease persisted, a subconscious awareness that equilibrium was fragile. That awareness explains humanity's recurring apocalyptic visions. They were not prophetic, they were inherited fear. Each temple was not a house of praise, but a house of memory, built against the possibility of another deluge. Some scholars dismiss this continuity as coincidence, the inevitable similarity of human psychology facing as cycles. But coincidence does not carve astronomical observatories across continents at the same epoch. Coincidence does not align stone circles with precession values identical to those found in Sumerian mathematics. What connects these phenomena is persistence. The survivors carried techniques not as technology but as faith. They practiced geometry as ritual, astronomy as liturgy, metallurgy as myth. What modern historians call superstition was, in truth, a degraded wearing the costume of devotion. The irony is profound. Civilization advanced by forgetting why it began. The builders of the early cities thought they were creating permanence, but they were only echoing earlier permanence lost to time. Their records of creation myths speak of gods bringing order from chaos. Not metaphor, but memory of themselves doing so under instruction from the past. In every act of rebuilding there was mimicry, as though they sensed an older pattern guiding their hands. Humanity's genius was not invention, but synthesis, assembling fragments of inherited design into coherent form once more. To imagine those survivors is to reimagine our origins. They were not primitive wanderers, but stewards of invisible heritage, carrying forward the ember of an extinguished fire. Under the stars of a new sky, they began again, not from zero, but from recollection half remembered. When they drew constellations, they were sketching the memory of calendars. When they built temples, they were mapping the geometry of grief. And in doing so, they laid the foundations of every civilization that would follow. In the silence between the flood's end and the city's birth lies the essence of the human condition. We are always beginning again, always misinterpreting echoes as epiphanies. The survivors of the deluge did not seek progress. They sought restoration. They built to commemorate what was lost, not to transcend it. Yet, in their failure to reproduce the original perfectly, they created something new. That paradox, memory giving birth to innovation, is how civilization resurrected itself. Even now, the DNA of those survivors lives within us, encoded not only biologically but culturally. Every myth we repeat, every symbol we carve, carries a residue of their catastrophe. We are descendants not of the inventors of civilization, but of its archivists. And as our seas rise once more, as our maps distort and our climate trembles, we find ourselves rehearsing the same questions they must once have whispered. How do you preserve knowledge when the world resets? The answer may already lie sleeping inside us, older than history, waiting for the next silence to begin its work. When the survivors of the Great Flood scattered, the earth was young again, cleansed yet wounded. They wandered across barren land, clutching fragments of a vanished memory. They sought alignment not only with the stars above, but with what had been lost beneath the waters. And somewhere in the high plains of what is now southeastern Anatolia, they began to build a monument so enigmatic, so deliberate, that even millennia later, its silence still commands reverence. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and to gaze upon it is to look directly into the archaeology of resurrection. The site lies buried within a mound of dust and limestone, a deliberate burial that baffled the first excavators. Unlike any known settlement, Göbekli Tepe was not a city, nor a temple dedicated to sustenance or defense. It was a machine made of memory and stone, its pillars carved long before the advent of pottery or metallurgy, each weighing tons. On these towering monoliths, foxes, vultures, serpents, and abstract symbols march across the surface like coded text. The carvings are precise, not ornamental. They speak of celestial order, of geometry once universal. Imagine the people who built it. They are supposed to have been hunter-gatherers, nomads with no architecture beyond shelters of hide. Yet here, on this desolate hill, they summon megaliths that required not improvisation, but mathematics. Each circle is laid out with trigonometric intent, each pillar oriented toward the rising of specific stars now shifted beyond recognition by precession. To modern scholars, this appears impossible. To those who sense the echoes of the lost world, it appears inevitable. Göbekli Tepe is not Genesis. It is remembrance crystallized in limestone. In its plan, you can trace the fingerprints of a world view older than agriculture. The central pillars of the enclosures, twin monoliths facing one another within a perfect circle, represent a polarity seen in the cosmos itself, the dialogue between heaven and earth, death and rebirth. Across their surfaces, animal totems constitute a living zodiac, marking epochs and transitions. When translated into astronomical time, these figures seem to point back 12,000 years, to the very era when ice melted and the sky burned. It is tempting to call it coincidence, but coincidence does not carve in 1,000-ton stone. The craftsmen of Göbekli Tepe worked not with experimentation, but adherence, as though following blueprints preserved through myth. They did not live permanently here. There are no traces of habitation, no domestic refuse, no graves. The place was not for life, but for ritual, a ritual of remembering. Far from representing the dawn of civilization, Göbekli Tepe feels like a farewell. Its builders appear to have erected it as a repository, then intentionally buried it beneath hundreds of tons of earth, as if concealing a document for future finders. They sealed their memory against time itself. Why bury what you have built with such devotion? There is something priestly in that gesture, something fearful. Perhaps they intuited that what was sacred could also be dangerous. Knowledge carried from a fallen world might draw the same catastrophe that destroyed it. So they entombed their inheritance. Like a time capsule for the unborn, Göbekli Tepe awaited rediscovery millennia later, when humanity would once more be ready to read it. To uncover it today is to interrupt its sleep. The dust removed is memory stirred. Structurally, its architecture defines impossible sophistication. The T-shaped monoliths align toward specific azimuths corresponding with solstitial sunrises and stellar conjunctions, calculations requiring a level of observational astronomy inconceivable for supposed primitives. Each circle fits within ratios measurable in integer harmonics, following a mathematical logic also found in the later pyramids of Egypt and in Sumerian metrology. The proportions of its enclosure walls echo the same sexagesimal precision that re-emerges thousands of years later in Babylonian tablets. Such continuity is not chance. It is transmission. Imagine walking among those stones at night. The wind carries dust that once lay sealed for 12 millennia. The moonlight casts long shadows across carvings that, though mute, radiate intention. There is no chaos in their spacing, no improvisation in their rhythm. You realize that this was not the experiment of a people learning to build, but the performance of a formula already understood. A civilization does not emerge fully fluent in monumental trigonometry, it recalls it. Göbekli Tepe is the first temple of rediscovery, the blueprint of civilization remembering itself. Yet to call it a temple simplifies what it represents. It is both laboratory and memorial, both observatory and altar. The absence of burial goods or idols implies function beyond worship. It is an interface between human and cosmic order. The reliefs depict animals not randomly but hierarchically, in sequences that can be interpreted as star maps recounting a celestial descent. The recurring vulture carrying a circle or an orb, may preserve memory of a comet or meteor impact, the same cosmic scar that ended the Younger Dryas. These carvings constitute both data and devotion, encoded observation in sacred myth. Archaeologists debate its age endlessly, but radiocarbon evidence repeatedly confirms an origin older than 9,500 years before Christ, deep into the memory of the cataclysm. If agriculture, pottery, and written language had yet to be discovered, then Göbekli Tepe rewrites that assumption entirely. It means that organized labor, symbolic abstraction, and mathematical ceremony existed when they should not have. And, if they existed, then where did they come from? The simplest answer, one too heretical for textbooks, is that they were inherited. Moreover, its deliberate burial around 8,000 years before Christ signals an act of closure rather than collapse. Whoever interred the site had the time and discipline to dismantle its significance intentionally. They were not destroyed. They withdrew. This conscious concealment transforms Göbekli Tepe into a message across ages. When catastrophe approaches, safeguard what matters by turning knowledge into monument and monument into silence. The earth would cover it, but the pattern would resurface when needed. Civilization, like geology, layers its memory. Consider again the geometry. The arrangement of pillars with those twin central monoliths dominating the axis mirrors diagrams found in later Mesopotamian cosmology, the representation of heavens and earth bound by symmetry. The motifs of circles within circles presage the orbital models of classical astronomy. The human figures carved into some pillars, rendered in minimal abstraction with folded hands, are not idols but personifications of principle, the embodiment of proportion, perhaps of the cosmic ratio itself. Every surface vibrates with intent, as if the builders were calibrating memory through art. And when the sun rises over the plateau, the first light floods the carvings in calculated sequence. Pillar shadows migrate like clock hands across serpent and vulture, as though recording time itself. These alignments link celestial observation with ritual reenactment, blending practicality with faith in a seamless code. What the people built was not superstition, it was synchronization. They were re-establishing rhythm with the heavens, trying to tune civilization back into cosmic order after the chaos of flood and fire. Architecture as frequency, as reconciliation. The emotional gravity of the site lingers beyond its data. To stand within its circular sanctuaries is to feel intimacy with minds unreachably ancient yet hauntingly familiar. The limestone breathes faintly in the heat, exhaling centuries of secrecy. Each mark speaks of a language that died before language itself became written form. It is as if those who carved here understood that direct speech could not survive time, but proportion might. The human urge to endure had become geometry, and geometry had become faith. Some suggest Göbekli Tepe represents the birth of religion, but it may be more accurate to say it represents the survival of by means of myth. Astronomy disguised as worship, metrology masked in ritual posture, the blueprint of resurrection encoded under the guise of reverence. After the deluge, numbers and stars would have seemed supernatural, their practical logic forgotten. By sanctifying what they could no longer rationalize, the survivors ensured that reverence, at least, would preserve structure. In devotion, knowledge found asylum. Through this lens, Göbekli Tepe becomes a cornerstone of continuity rather than innovation. Its existence bridges two epochs, the world before memory and the world that would forget. What we see as the spark of civilization may instead be its afterimage. The builders inherited formulas from teachers who no longer walked the earth, then transformed those remnants into stone scripture. In doing so, they transmitted not just data but a directive that humanity's purpose is to remember through creation. Every temple since then echoes that primal vow. Today, the hill where it sleeps is quiet again. The excavation pits expose circles once hidden for 12 millennia, and scholars measure, debate, recalibrate. Yet the significance of Göbekli Tepe resists academic containment. It is not artifact, it is mirror. It reflects back to us the terror and triumph of remembering too much after forgetting nearly everything. Its sand-sheathed pillars remind us that civilization began not with invention, but with confession. The confession that something vast was lost. That every act of building is an act of mourning. Perhaps that is why the site feels sacred even to those without faith. Its silence hums with intention. It stands as proof that humanity's first monumental act was not to celebrate achievement, but to resist oblivion. In the geometry of Göbekli Tepe, one perceives the heartbeat of an ancient defiance, that knowledge can survive extinction if carved deep enough into earth. The blueprint of resurrection still lies there, patient as stone, waiting for each new age to reawaken and read it once more. When the dust settled after the world's long thaw, the survivors gathered not in chaos but in calculation. They settled in river valleys that remembered the sea, in sediment that still shimmered with the breath of the flood. And from that soil, rich with memory, they built cities of order. Among them, one land emerged with such sudden sophistication that its very origin defied explanation: Sumer, the birthplace not of invention but of restoration. A people whose first written symbols already carried the echo of mathematics, precise enough to map the heavens. To step into the recovered fragments of Sumerian civilization is to enter a world where the ordinary appears anomalously perfect. Their earliest tablets, etched in wedge-shaped script, speak not of primitive trade but of geometry, ratios, and celestial measurement. Before kings were named, before myth found its voice, they counted. They recorded every motion of the sky with obsessive accuracy, as if building a record against forgetting. At the core of their culture stood a number, 60, a base system too elegant to be random, too universal to be new. Time, angle, and cosmic order all spoke in its multiples. The sexagesimal code was their inheritance. The scholars of the modern age call it the sexagesimal system, a mathematical base of 60 that allows every fraction of an hour, or arc, or calendar cycle to divide cleanly. But such simplicity hides its mystery. 60 is divisible by every number from 1 through 6, without remainder, a property so efficient that even digital systems today cannot improve upon it. To the Sumerians, these harmonies were not coincidence. They were sacred correspondences, echoes of how the cosmos arranged itself before the flood. The pattern was older than Sumer, older perhaps than language itself. The mathematicians of Sumer remembered through numbers. Their clay tablets, baked by the fires of accident and time, preserve calculations too advanced for the era. On prisms scarcely larger than a hand, one finds triplets of integers that obey complex relationships. The ratios known as Pythagorean emerge here thousands of years before Pythagoras was born. Whole sequences correspond to geometric truths modern builders rediscovered only in the last few centuries. The Sumerians called their art measurement of heaven and earth, a discipline where mathematics was devotion and precision was prayer. When they calculated, they believed they communed with eternity. To understand the audacity of their knowledge, imagine a world with no metal instruments, No optical tools, no telescopes, yet one that could predict lunar phases centuries ahead. The great ziggurats rising from the plain of the Euphrates were not merely temples. They were instruments calibrated to the cosmos itself. Each step, each angle of the terraces aligned with a star's seasonal journey. The city was built as a diagram of heaven, its bricks obeying arithmetic so exact that the shadow of the tower traced equinox and solstice like a giant clock. Theirs was not merely architecture, it was alignment. Within this geometry, one finds the lingering fingerprint of an older intelligence. The Sumerians themselves never claimed authorship of their systems. They said it was given. Their word for wisdom, me, referred not to abstract learning but to divine decrees, the codified laws of balance by which heavens and mortals were synchronized. Even their language structured knowledge as something remembered rather than invented. When scribes etched the first signs of calculation into clay, they did so in reverence, preserving what they believed had once been handed down before the waters erased everything. Their records enumerate planetary cycles with astonishing precision. Venus, for example, was tracked across nearly 8 years, its appearances logged with deviations smaller than single days. The consistency of such observation defies the technological means available to them, suggesting methods or traditions inherited across uncounted generations. A sky-watching culture before the city, an astronomer's lineage predating civilization itself. It is as though the mathematics of the sky survived the flood and simply found new hands to hold the stylus. Every number on those tablets is a fragment of the world before the deluge. Consider the concept of the year itself. The Sumerians defined it not purely solar nor purely lunar, but harmonized between cycles. They orchestrated an intercalation system, adding measured days to reconcile heaven's larger rhythm with Earth's slower beat. This dance between calendars was the essence of their worldview. Balance through correction. In their cosmology, chaos was error, and error was sin. To be righteous was to calculate correctly, to embody the universe's arithmetic order. Even morality was measured. Archaeologists find it unsettling that a civilization could emerge fully literate in mathematics. There are no Proto-Sumerian number systems, no gradual ascent from simple counting marks to algebraic statements. The complexity is immediate. It appears in the record as if switched on, activated by memory rather than discovery. When the first city walls rose from the alluvium, they already reflected ratios consistent with later Greek geometry. The wheel, the arch, the decimal division of circles, all appear without preamble as though civilization blossomed entire from the seed, left buried by catastrophe. One of the most extraordinary relics of their intellect is a clay tablet often cited for its numerical perfection. Engraved upon its surface are columns of reciprocals, square roots, and right-angled triangles, each computed flawlessly. It is a work of abstract understanding centuries before abstraction had a name. Yet the text is bureaucratic in tone, a ledger, not a manifesto, suggesting this knowledge was institutional, not mystical. Mathematics was not secret in Sumer, it was administrative. And that might be the greatest clue of all. They were not inventing, they were applying forgotten rules as daily routine. The scribal schools of early Sumer illustrate this continuity. Young apprentices learn to convert weights and measures using systems far beyond simple trade, incorporating fractions, reciprocals, and geometric proportions. These systems presuppose an awareness of base 60 arithmetic and advanced units of volume and distance. Each numeric table was copied slavishly, as if the pattern mattered more than comprehension. Copying itself became ritual preservation. Through repetition, memory endured even when understanding faded. Civilization functioned like a living archive, reciting formulas first understood by vanished ancestors. The question then arises, how could such refinement appear so early? To those who read history linearly, the answer is impossible. To those who see cycles, it is inevitable. Sumer was not the beginning, but the return, a reactivation of knowledge stored within humanity's dormant collective, stirring once the world stabilized enough to record again. The ancestors of Sumer were survivors of the deluge, and their intellect, though dimmed by trauma, was too luminous to vanish completely. Time had buried their teachers, but not their lessons. In every subsequent empire that borrowed from Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, the same pattern recurs. Their priests are mathematicians. Their theology is arithmetic. To know God is to measure proportion. The heavens were mirrors, the temples instruments. Even justice was geometrized. Balance, weight, symmetry. Numbers ruled all. Behind the divine kings and myths of creation hid the quiet persistence of a trying to remember itself. When priests inscribed laws onto stelae, they were reviving the cosmic geometry that once kept the stars in order. Society itself became an equation of remembrance. The legacy of their mathematics transcended death. When Babylon succeeded Sumer, the base of 60 persisted, its fingerprints remaining even in modern timekeeping. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. Our clocks still count in their language. Our geometry still breathes their structure. We calculate in the shadow of their forgotten minds. In many ways, the Sumerians did not vanish. They translated themselves into mathematics, ensuring that the next civilization, even if ignorant of their name, would still obey their proportions. Some modern scholars translate these achievements simply as an innovation, the natural product of sedentary life. But the abrupt perfection of Sumer suggests otherwise. Their brilliance is reticence turned tangible, a repository for knowledge that did not belong to them alone. They existed within a continuum reaching backward beyond recall, beyond ice and flood. Theirs was the mathematics of remembrance, a liturgy of numbers recited by men who feared forgetting more than dying. Each wedge pressed into clay was an act of reclamation. If we accept this, the narrative of history bends toward recursion. Every era rediscovers the architecture of proportion, the same ratios disguised under new materials, the same sacred geometries renamed as innovation. What the Sumerians preserved in clay, later generations grasped through stone, then glass, then code. The medium changes, but the pattern remains immutable. The forgotten mathematicians of Sumer taught us not how to count, but how to remember through counting. And in that remembrance, we unknowingly speak the arithmetic of the world before memory. When we glance at our clocks or trace the circle's division, we invoke their ghost without knowing it. We obey a cadence older than civilization, older even than myth. Every measured angle, every reckoned second is a syllable of their unspoken language. The ancestors of Sumer are still teaching through time itself. And perhaps that was their intention all along, to encode eternity into routine, so that even when the flood came again, its waters would find humanity already counting the seconds of its return. Before cities rose and calendars existed, memory took the form of story. When words were still sacred instruments and writing was unknown, myth carried what history could not. In this fragile medium, the great trauma of the Younger Dryas was preserved. Though spoken in differing languages and adorned with local names, it was always the same story, the flood that erased a world. And hidden behind its allegory lies a record so consistent it rivals the data locked within stone and ice. The flood myth is universal. From the mountains of Anatolia to the highlands of Peru, from Polynesia to the Arctic, humanity remembers a time when the waters rose and day ceased to behave like day. If these were merely cultural coincidences, the details would diverge wildly, but they align with eerie precision, the fiery precursor, the darkness that followed. The deluge and the few who survived upon high ground or vessel. These are not creations of imagination. They are survivors reciting natural history in symbolic form. Geology speaks the same language with different grammar. In the sediments of lakes and seas, one finds abrupt transitions from fertile soil to sterile sand, from habitation layer to chaos. Thick deposits of silt and freshwater diatoms overlay marine beds, marking a surge of meltwater violent enough to transform entire coastlines. 12,000 years ago, the world drowned. The silence of that geological evidence hums in resonance with what the myths still whisper. Story and sediment are two halves of the same memory. Across the Middle East, the Sumerian clay tablets naming Ziusudra refer to a flood that swallowed all cities save one. Far west in Greece, the tale became the voyage of Deucalion. In India, it was Manu. Among the Maya, an entire sun cycle perished beneath the sea. The Aboriginal elders of Australia speak of shorelines walking inland, carrying their ancestors' homes into the waves. None of these narratives knew each other, and yet they all describe the same stratigraphic moment, the end of the Pleistocene, when ice turned to ocean and humanity forgot its first name. The correspondence between mythic and physical layers is not metaphorical, it is measurable. Marine sediment cores reveal tsunami surges in sequences that match the approximate span of the alleged deluge periods. The isotope data mirrors myth's cadence: warmth, fire, torrent, calm. It is as though every ancient storyteller was an unknowing geologist, encoding stratigraphy with the syntax of morality. Their gods punish not sin, but imbalance, a metaphorical way of describing ecological collapse. The world's first parable was an environmental report. But beyond environmental truth, these stories hold something stranger: memory of engineering, of preparation. In the Sumerian and Babylonian accounts, the ark is not a simple boat, but a ziggurat afloat, a cube aligned by precise ratios. In the Maya version, the survivors flee not on wooden vessels, but within mountains that move. In Andean tradition, those who endure seek refuge in long caverns high above the seas, possibly glacier tunnels transformed into sanctuaries. Myth remembers the architecture of survival. The patterns match flood refuge sites found worldwide, all consistent with rapid sea level rise. When the earth warmed and ice sheets collapsed, oceans climbed more than 100 vertical meters in mere centuries. Entire coastlines, Lemuria, Sunderland, Doggerland, disappeared beneath this planetary cataract. Modern sonar maps still trace their riverbeds and harbours etched into rock now far below the surface. If we could drain the oceans, we would reveal the first drowned cities of humankind. Plato may have called one Atlantis, but to its survivors, it was simply home. The flood was neither myth nor punishment. It was stratigraphy performing erasure. The correspondence between myth chronology and meltwater pulses is too precise to ignore. The so-called meltwater pulse one, occurring around 12,000 years ago, coincides with the earliest flood myths in both hemispheres. even the timeline of the Egyptian dynastic inheritance fits, with priests later claiming descent from pre-flood ancestors whose temples were older than the sky. Such declarations, long dismissed as boasting, align eerily with the erosion patterns found at the Sphinx and other ancient structures. Both story and stone agree: the flood washed away more than land. It erased civilization's memory. Imagine standing at that junction of worlds where glaciers shrink and ancient rivers turn against their valleys. The air tastes of salt and ash. Storms wheel like cosmic machinery, thunder echoing across continents. The survivors climb vast ridges or seek refuge in caverns, clutching children and relics whose meanings elude them. Each time the lightning recedes, they watch the horizon move closer. The event would have been global theatre, disaster performed simultaneously beneath 1,000 different skies. The same terror carved the same story into every human tongue. It is often said that myth simplifies reality, but here the opposite may be true. The flood narrative renders the incomprehensible survivable. It recasts extinction into moral symmetry, destruction following hubris, salvation following virtue. Yet beneath the moral veil lies precision. The number of days of the flood, the sequence of celestial signs, the description of a sky darkened by smoke, all correlate with what now calls the Younger Dryas boundary event. The world's storytellers were eyewitnesses. Their poetry endures as data. This realization transforms mythology from superstition into archive. Each tale becomes a coordinate within a larger dataset, its symbolic syntax masking empirical memory. For example, when a culture speaks of the sun standing still or darkness before dawn, it may describe atmospheric dust blocking the sky after an impact. When it recounts the sea devouring the mountains, it preserves the physics of glacial runoff. Memory translates mechanics into metaphor so it can traverse millennia without losing emotional weight. The flood myths are not faith, they are information. Even the most ornate legends retain technical fingerprints. The Mesopotamian arc dimensions adhere to a 6:1 ratio, an exact hydrodynamic proportion known to shipwrights only thousands of years later. The Hebrew narrative preserves a nearly identical geometry. The Indian myth describes guidance by a cosmic fish, pulling the vessel by rope, a poetic echo of alignment to celestial markers guiding navigation. Each fragment of poetry conceals formula. Underneath the phrases breathe equations, and beneath the equations hums geology. Story and are not enemies, they are translations of one another. Across the Pacific, Polynesian oral traditions recount entire archipelagos swallowed overnight. Their songs speak of lands that sank so completely that neither reef nor memory remained. Modern bathymetry reveals subsided volcanic platforms corresponding precisely with those local legends. The same occurs in the Americas, where tribal myths remember glaciers melting and mammoths drinking from rising seas. Archaeological layers confirm the transition. Around 11,000 years ago, the largest species vanished, and humanity shifted from hunter to farmer. The flood was not merely an environmental turning point, it was evolution forced by catastrophe. To read the flood myths as literal stories of divine anger is to miss their deeper wisdom. They functioned as transgenerational emergency codes. Each culture, conscious of its fragility, embedded warning into narrative. The moral element, hubris punished by water, is a cipher for imbalance punished by physics. Civilization itself is a balancing act, and water remains the symbol of retribution for excess. Thus, the flood endures in the human mind as eternal recurrence. Every age that forgets equilibrium must relive the deluge in new form. In the modern era, the parallel is again unsettling. The ice melts anew. The climate shifts abruptly, signaling not punishment, but repetition. The flood myth becomes prophecy when interpreted through the lens of cyclical geology. Our ancestors told us not that floods would never cease, but that the forgetting of balance ensures their return. Sediment becomes scripture once more, and if humanity fails to translate it correctly, the next cataclysm will write its own myth for those who survive us. Between the mythic and the measurable stands a revelation. Storytelling is a kind of the ancients could practice without instruments. Their myths encoded observation, condensed into narrative rhythm rather than formula. Every recitation was both ritual and data preservation. The priest was also historian, and his ceremony a record-keeping mechanism. When the clay eroded and temples crumbled, spoken myth endured because sound outlasts stone. The pulse of speech carried truth across the abyss of time. Even now, when satellites track melting glaciers and algorithms chart climate oscillations, the language of apocalypse remains ancient. We say the seas will rise, storms will come, the earth will cleanse itself. The phrasing is mythic because the memory is. The modern scientific prediction is simply the ancient prophecy in new syntax. We are, as ever, descendants of those who told the flood story around trembling fires. Their warnings live in our vocabulary, their fear in our bones. The data layers within ice cores and the myths carved into clay are one poem sung by two kinds of witness. Perhaps this is the greater message of the deluge, that memory persists even when literacy fails, that truth can submerge without drowning. The flood, whether cosmic or climatic, becomes metaphor for the erasure every civilization faces. What ensures endurance is not stone or code, but transmission, the act of telling. Every generation must translate the same warning, that arrogance invites dissolution, and only remembrance ensures equilibrium. The flood myths are not about God destroying the world, they are about the world restoring itself. When the waters receded 12,000 years ago, humanity awoke to a transformed planet. Shorelines glittered where mountains had stood. The constellations seemed altered. The memories felt unreliable, but they preserved the story. And across time, through languages and empires and faiths, that story survives. It binds the scientific and the sacred, reminding us that the earth keeps its own archive. Soil and scripture are parts of the same book. In the end, every myth is a fossil, and every fossil a stanza in the poem of the planet's memory. Long after the floodwaters receded, stone became the chosen language of remembrance. Civilization began to speak again, but not with syllables. Its syntax was built from weight, angle, and symmetry. Across continents, monuments rose as if responding to some invisible resonance that echoed through every surviving culture. The pyramids of Egypt, the platformed temples of the Andes, the cyclopean rings of Europe, each structure different in shape, yet speaking the same grammar of eternal alignment. Humanity was sketching memory into bedrock, translating the lost order into permanence. To the modern observer, these structures appear as scattered achievements, isolated peaks of ingenuity emerging independently. But their geometry betrays a different story. The ratio hidden in their proportions, the orientation of entrances, and the celestial alignments carved into their corridors suggest a single origin, a mathematical dialect shared across oceans. How could stonemasons separated by hemispheres have conceived the same architecture of precision? There were no maps connecting them, no contact by sea. What they shared was remembrance. The world that built before the flood had returned in traces, guiding their hands through heritage rather than discovery. Imagine the scene in the high desert of Egypt as early builders mark the ground with strings and pegs, measuring the impossible. Their line of sight extends not toward any coastline, but toward the stars. Geometry is their compass, and heaven their blueprint. What rises is an equation translated into architecture, a function of proportions that recurs, unaltered, in temples thousands of miles away. The builders were not designing, they were reconstructing, retrieving from memory the parameters of a world that once synchronized sky and earth. Consider the Great Pyramid. Its base perimeter divided by double its height produces a ratio indistinguishable from pi, while its orientation aligns within fractions of a degree to true north. Such precision is unexplainable as coincidence or convenience. It resonates instead as continuity, a formula repeated across epochs. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman curve with the same harmonic pattern, locking each stone in seismic perfection. In Britain, the circles of Stonehenge measure both lunar and solar cycles with uncanny fidelity. These builders were speaking in numbers, communicating through angles rather than words. Wherever they were, they built instruments of memory. Their choice of stone was not aesthetic, it was existential. Stone endures vibration and cataclysm. Where wood rots and clay dissolves, granite remains, holding both the heat of the day and the memory of centuries. The architects of stone were not building for the living, they were transmitting to the unborn. Each block was a paragraph of permanence, each alignment a reference point designed for rediscovery. They built not for their gods, but for the next cycle of humans who would need to remember how to measure again. In their silence lies instruction. Even the method of construction whispers of sophistication beyond plausibility. Near-perfect joins of irregular stones, weight-balanced without mortar, suggest a comprehension of forces measured, not guessed. The architecture anticipates earthquake and erosion, suggesting empirical knowledge of resonance frequencies, the same laws later rediscovered by modern engineers. The walls seem to breathe with the planet, expanding and contracting imperceptibly, alive in their precision. This is not primitive architecture, it is acoustic and gravitational technology carved into matter. Across the ocean, the megaliths of Pumapunku in Bolivia rest at an altitude where the air itself seems too thin for labor. Yet their blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, are cut with machine-like symmetry, lines so straight they defy handheld tools. Their angles define right triangles of exact 90 degrees, complete with interlocking joints and recessed edges, reminiscent of prefabrication. The logic of their assembly follows no artistic whim, but mathematical necessity. The same geometric logic breathes within Giza, within Angkor, within Malta. Across ages, humanity reenacted the same forgotten theorem in topographic poetry. The architects of stone did not sketch by imagination, they remembered by tactile repetition. Every wall mirrored a chart of motion, every pillar a frozen vibration. Some researchers speak of harmonic architecture, the concept that sacred spaces were tuned to cosmic or planetary frequencies. Whether or not this interpretation holds, it captures the intention the builders seem to grasp instinctively. They sculpted resonance, aligning matter to vibration in order to stabilize memory. When earthquakes struck, these sites hummed rather than cracked. The language of monument was also the language of equilibrium. Now imagine them from the viewpoint of time, a procession of generations carving under endless sky. They quarry blocks knowing each placement matters not just materially, but ceremonially. Their labors are both physical and metaphysical, a dialogue with ancestors whose teachings survive only through dimension. Every measurement acts as invocation. They do not call themselves scientists, yet their craft generates instruments of cosmic calibration. The structure becomes a kind of tuning fork resonating with lost knowledge, its geometry humming faintly with purpose. The repetition of the same patterns in disparate lands demands explanation. Lines connecting ancient sites often align with exact latitude parallels and astronomical meridians. Great circles drawn around the globe pass through locations sacred to cultures with no known interaction. It is as though an invisible grid governed their selection of coordinates, a lattice of remembrance linking mountains, temples, and pyramids in unified geometry. The architects of stone mapped the earth as if they already knew its curvature, its orientation, its mathematical soul. Their monuments formed a planetary memory system. What would drive a civilization to such obsessive precision except fear of forgetting? After the deluge, those who survived understood impermanence with dreadful intimacy. They no longer trusted memory to endure unanchored. To ensure remembrance, they wrote in matter too heavy to erase. Stone became scripture. The alignment of blocks replaced the alignment of words. The architects of stone became the scribes of eternity, inscribing knowledge not on clay that could shatter, but on foundations that would outlive continents. They were archivists of resilience. Their legacy shaped every civilization that followed, often invisibly. The Greeks inherited proportion through myth, calling it harmony. The Egyptians encoded it in Ma'at, the cosmic balance. The Chinese measured heaven and earth through feng shui, which is geometry and breath rather than brick. Each tradition claims independence, yet all trace to the same impulse, to restore coherence between the human and the celestial. The architect was priest, the temple his theorem. When modern builders raise glass towers toward the sun, they unknowingly imitate this ancient urge to mirror the sky. At the heart of these works lies an enigma. They seem built for observers greater than their users. Scale overwhelms human proportion, suggesting purpose beyond ritual. Perhaps these immense forms were designed to be visible from the heavens, a message to whatever watches from above that we remembered. Or perhaps the builders sought to speak to the future, carving into horizon and altitude the assurance that intelligence had once existed here. Stone alone could perform such a transmission through aeons. Metal rusts, speech fades. But stone, if locked in proportion, sings forever. For the architects, the act of building was neither vanity nor rebellion, but prayer through measurement. In their silence, we sense humility, a surrender to the universe's design rather than an assertion of dominance. They built to align themselves with the cosmos, to echo the original architecture of creation. Even when we cannot read their inscriptions, we can feel their equations. Each precision-cut joint, each mathematical orientation, is a pulse from minds who refuse to allow knowledge's extinction. Their faith was structural. Their theology was symmetry. Today we walk among their ruins as if among ghosts. We call them mysteries, marvels, enigmas, but they are none of these. They are confirmations that humanity's memory is cyclical, that even after amnesia, our species rebuilds the same truths. The blueprints of resonance reawaken each time we rediscover proportion. When we study these ancient stones with lasers and drones, we do not uncover their secrets. We recognize our own forgotten reflection. The architects of stone were us, in a previous remembering. Each weight placed, each shadow calculated, embodied one defiant conviction that knowledge could be made immortal through geometry. Their monuments are our mirror across the flood of time. Whether in the Andes, the deserts of Egypt, or the hills of Ireland, their logic whispers the same refrain. Remember, because forgetting remakes catastrophe. To study their stones is to read the first paragraphs of our species' true memoir, carved not for praise, but for prevention. The architects of stone built monuments of memory against the next great forgetting, counting on us to listen before silence arrives again. For centuries, humanity has framed its history as ascent, a climb from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward understanding. But what if the truth is inverted? What if civilization was not born from discovery, but from recovery? The ruins we revere as beginnings may in fact be restorations guided by faint memory, humanity piecing together fragments of an older order shattered long before Sumer or Egypt breathed. The story of our origins, when stripped of vanity, becomes not evolution, but reconstruction. Every civilization carries this paradox within its foundation myths. The Sumerians spoke of divine scribes who taught them measures already perfected. The Egyptians credited gods with knowledge of number, proportion, and law. The Greeks celebrated the Titans as ancestors of. Such narratives do not depict invention, they describe remembrance. The knowledge was always presented as pre-existing, waiting to be reawakened. Humanity cast itself as inheritor, not creator, writing over the ashes of what it could no longer fully recall. To grasp this inversion, one must look beyond linear progress. The archaeological record resists the simplicity of our textbooks. Complex architecture arises fully formed. Mathematics appears codified. Astronomical precision blooms suddenly out of silence. There is no recognizable progression, only appearance and transmission. It is as if civilization keeps remembering itself after long intervals of forgetting, each era translating fragments of a vanished blueprint into its own idiom. History, then, is cyclic, a pendulum swinging between amnesia and recall. Language itself betrays this cycle. Ancient scripts often represent not invention, but adaptation of earlier symbols already infused with meaning. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets, for instance, show signs consistent with pre-literacy recording systems that have no surviving precedent. Similarly, the hieroglyphic system of Egypt arrives essentially complete, syntax intact. Pictographs evolved as though derived from an absent parent language. The suddenness suggests restoration from memory rather than incremental invention. Each new script is a translation of an older silence. This principle extends beyond language into the geometry and metaphysics of civilization. Across cultures, identical ratios reappear, the golden mean, circles divided into 360 parts, harmonic intervals reproducing frequency relationships mirrored in planetary orbits. These are constants rediscovered, not designed. The philosophers of Greece, successors to an Egyptian priesthood already ancient in their time, did not invent harmony, they inherited it. Their revelations were restorations of datasets older than parchment itself. In that sense, the act of knowing becomes archaeological. Every discovery humanity makes is the uncovering of something it once knew and forgot. The shape of an atom, the curve of an orbit, the calculus of time, all are fragments excavated from deeper strata of the collective mind. The process feels like creation because forgetting is complete. Each rediscovery feels like a dawn, yet behind every dawn lies an unacknowledged dusk. We live perpetually inside aftermath, mistaking recovery for origin. The ancient builders seem to know this implicitly. Their temples enshrined not beginnings, but continuity. The ziggurat, the pyramid, the mandala, all duplicate cosmic maps, anchoring human order to celestial rhythm. Their ritual calendars synchronized the earth's labor with the heavens, preserving the mechanics of recurrence. These were not myths of creation ex nihilo. They were myths of return, ceremonies to rejoin a legacy momentarily severed. The phrase, as above, so below, encoded not poetry but policy. Restoration as sacred duty. Consider again the flood narratives, not as punishment myths, but as operating instructions for a reset. The survivors were charged with re-establishing equilibrium, restoring the balance of proportion and reciprocity between humanity and cosmos. Across continents, priesthoods arose whose task was not innovation, but conservation. Their sacred offices preserved measurement, law, and architecture precisely because these embodied cosmic harmony. Civilization's core function was maintenance. To build rightly was to remember rightly. But memory degrades even when encoded in granite. Successive generations reinterpret survival mechanisms as faith, treat formulas as metaphor, and gradually lose comprehension. Knowledge curdles into dogma, then ritual. The priests become bureaucrats of a system they no longer comprehend, preserving structure without understanding foundation. What was once becomes superstition. What was once method becomes myth. This entropy cycles endlessly. After each collapse, the next age must excavate both intellectually and literally the residue of its ancestors' cognition. Restoration continues, but clarity diminishes with each iteration. The evidence of these cycles is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. In architecture, the same geometric canon emerges repeatedly after long absences. In measurement, base 60 systems return disguised as convenience. In philosophy, the doctrines of balance, union, and celestial harmony reappear, renamed but unchanged. Even art mirrors these oscillations. Realism fades into abstraction, then returns, always echoing its origins. Humanity cannot escape these recurrences because they are inscribed in its psychology. The flood may erase memory, but pattern remains as instinct. Restoration explains the uncanny feeling of recognition that accompanies ancient sites. Standing before the weathered stones of a pyramid or the carved spirals at a Neolithic shrine, one feels not curiosity, but nostalgia. These structures are not alien, they are familiar in a way that bypasses time. The alignment, the proportion, the geometry appeal to something older than intellect, as though they resonate with frequencies deeply human, yet pre-cultural. Why do we find symmetry beautiful? Because it is remembrance disguised as aesthetic. Harmony is the echo of heritage. Even the concept of the divine reflects this rediscovery process. Gods were often described as architects, lawgivers, builders, record keepers, the deified archetypes of restoration. Humanity projected onto the heavens the same responsibility it bore on earth, to rebuild the cosmos, to maintain order against disintegration. The flood destroyed the world not out of malice, but to reset its misaligned harmonies. To worship these gods was to participate in cyclical restoration, a covenant to keep remembering. The divine plan was not to begin anew, but to recall perfectly. This cycle of remembering and forgetting creates an illusion of linear progress. We measure advancement by technological accumulation, mistaking external novelty for internal evolution. Yet the fundamentals, mathematics, geometry, moral law, metaphysical curiosity, never evolve. they recur. What changes is our fidelity in expression, our clarity of recall. The myth of progress comforts the modern ego, but the artifacts of the past stand in quiet contradiction. We are not pioneers, we are restorers repeating inherited code in new syntax. Restoration also explains the psychological restlessness of humanity. We build and destroy, seek and abandon, as though haunted by an absence we cannot name. Somewhere in our collective unconscious lies the imprint of a lost equilibrium, a template of harmony once experienced and irretrievably shattered. Every age attempts reconstruction. One calls it enlightenment, another Renaissance, another revolution. Yet all chase the same horizon, mistaking reconstruction for invention. The ghost we follow is our own forgotten perfection. If civilization is restoration, then its ultimate purpose is not expansion, but remembrance. The archives, museums, and libraries we cherish are modern ziggurats, repositories of the past meant to bridge eras. Our sciences and arts, our philosophies and rituals are all ways of keeping intimacy with something vast and ancient within us. Without that tether, knowledge degenerates into noise. Restoration is therefore not nostalgia. It is survival through continuity. Humanity's memory must be constantly rebuilt, or the species forgets itself into extinction. But restoration is imperfect by every copy loses resolution, every translation distorts tone. The ancients preserved geometries because number is less corruptible than word, but even numbers decay when context dissolves. The decimal point may survive, yet meaning shifts. Each resurrection of civilization begins already compromised, destined to misremember some fraction of truth. Yet that imperfection carries hope. It allows adaptation, new expression, synthesis. Restoration is not static repetition. It is living memory reforming itself anew. This understanding reframes the purpose of human history. We are archivists of a cosmos intent on forgetting itself through entropy. The flood, the fall, the collapse. These are not punishments, but resets in a divine equation. Each cycle demands new interpreters, new restorers to rebuild the bridge between eras. The scientists of today are heirs to priests of Sumer, the coders to astronomers of Egypt. All serve the same function, recovering coherence from oblivion. Civilization's endurance depends on the courage to restore rather than reinvent. If the ancient world was not our dawn but our echo, then humility becomes our highest wisdom. We are not alone at the summit of progress. We stand atop ruins of our own forgotten brilliance. The dust of lost epochs clings to every theorem, every cathedral, every act of art. Restoration humbles us because it reveals continuity too vast for ownership. To remember truly is to serve as custodian of a story older than humanity itself. A story written in stars, stone, and silence. Perhaps that is what the ancients tried to tell us through their monuments, their myths, their mathematics, that nothing here began. Everything is a return. Our civilizations are not seedlings but regrowth from buried root. The goal is not innovation, but fidelity, to restore the pattern so perfectly that the difference between origin and resurrection disappears. When that happens, the cycles align, the memory completes its circuit, and humanity briefly recalls the secret it keeps forgetting, that the future is ancient and the past is still being rebuilt. Civilization begins with fire and ends with it. Between those two blazes lies the fragile span of everything we call progress. Fire is the element of rebirth, the spark that shapes metal, lights knowledge, and consumes arrogance. 12,000 years ago, the world burned before it drowned, and humanity learned that flame is both destroyer and archivist. For when the flood erased the libraries of Earth, fire engraved memory into the hearts of survivors. They carried its light into the next dawn, unaware that it would also return one day as judgment. The memory of fire lingers in every myth of creation and destruction. The gods of the ancient Near East punish with fire from the heavens. The sages of India describe cycles of burning between ages. Even modern admits the sky has rained fire before. Cometary impacts, solar storms, volcanic winters, all are manifestations of the same cosmic rhythm. Fire renews the planet by scouring it clean. The ancients did not fear it because they misunderstood it, but because they remembered it. They knew that when the world forgets equilibrium, the heavens correct it through flame. In Sumer and Babylon, the element of fire held a paradoxical holiness. It was purity and punishment, symbol of divinity as well as of ruin. The temple lamps that never extinguished represented more than devotion. They were signals, echoes of a lost covenant with the stars. The steady flame on the altar was a miniature of a cosmic blaze that once swept the earth. Keeping it alive was both reverence and warning. To let it die was to risk forgetting, to tempt another cleansing. Every great civilization has mythologies describing celestial fire. In Egypt, the solar god rides his bark through realms of flame each night, purging chaos before resurrection. In Mesoamerica, the world ends in burning suns that blind the gods themselves. Among the Greek philosophers, fire is the primal matter from which all forms arise. Behind the poetry lies a collective recollection that the skies once exploded, that the ground glowed and the oceans boiled, and that humanity barely endured. The stories of divine rage are masks worn by geological fact. Stripping away allegory rediscovers this memory layer by layer. The carbon bands in glacier ice, the nano-diamonds fused by heat, the traces of iridium buried deep within sediment, all testify to a global burning that marked the end of one era and the reluctant birth of another. The ancients spoke of fire falling from stars because they watched the atmosphere ignite with debris. The fires of heaven and the floods of earth were one catastrophe told two ways, and the human conscience has carried that trauma ever since. There is a reason we find light both comforting and terrifying. On the symbolic level, fire evokes knowledge, illumination dispelling the dark. But on a subconscious level, it awakens memory, that deep genetic tremor from a time when flame consumed the familiar sky. Each hearth, each candle, each festival of light is an attempt to domesticate that trauma. Civilization's entire history of illumination, from torches to neon, is a dialogue with the same ancestral blaze. We kindle light not only to see, but to reassure ourselves that the fire now obeys us. Yet obedience is temporary. In the laboratories of our modern age, humanity has rekindled the celestial furnace. We split atoms and call the result innovation. We summon plasma to mimic the sun. The same element that once purified us now serves our ambition. But beneath that pursuit of mastery lurks a whisper of repetition. Every civilization to wield fire as power rather than offering eventually meets the same quiet reckoning. We become our own catastrophe, invoking the flame without the humility to balance it. The ancients encoded this awareness into architecture and myth alike. Temples aligned with the solstice recorded not simply celestial timing, but cosmic cycles of renewal through heat. Seasonal fires, ritual burnings, funeral pyres, all reenact the universe's rhythm of destruction and rebirth. Fire consumes so that form may return purer. In that logic lies the hidden philosophy of resilience, the understanding that to forget is to ignite the wrong blaze, but to remember is to tend it wisely. Humanity's survival has always depended on the discipline to distinguish warmth from annihilation. Imagine the moment 12 millennia ago when the atmosphere burned. Dust clouded the sky, rivers boiled into steam, forests turned to glass. The survivors would have watched the horizon redden like molten ore, believing the gods themselves were descending. In that terror, reverence was born. Every spark kindled afterward carried moral weight, a promise made in fear. To handle flame became a covenant, not a convenience. The simple act of lighting a lamp was a prayer of restraint. Even now, when we forge steel and send rockets to the edge of space, the same covenant haunts us. We are custodians of forces we did not invent, but reawakened. Our engines run on miniature suns, our cities glow in imitation of stars, and our weapons recreate the brightness of forgotten comets. Fire never left. It merely changed hosts. It waits, as it always has, for imbalance to call it forth again. The memory that sleeps in our myths might soon awaken in our machines. The cycle always begins with mastery and ends with submission. Sumer mastered irrigation and fell to drought. Rome mastered conquest and burned under its triumphs. Each repetition is a spark that forgets its source. The ancients recorded these warnings not as moral fable, but as physical law. Entropy demands recurrence. Arrogance ensures ignition. Our technology, miraculous yet fragile, mirrors the excess of those lost epochs. It is as though the same hand that wrote the flood also scripts our future in plasma and heat. Fire as teacher does not negotiate. It instructs by erasure. Every archive eventually smoulders. Every epoch leaves ash. Yet within that ash lies continuity, the seeds of the next remembering. The charcoal of burned forests fertilized the valleys that birthed agriculture. The destruction of cities cleared the slate for innovation. Fire's cruelty births comprehension. Civilization's true genius has never been in avoiding the flame, but in learning how to rise from it differently each time. There is a haunting symmetry in this truth. The very element that once annihilated our ancestors also safeguarded them. In the darkness after the sky fire, those who controlled flame survived. They gathered around warmth when the sun failed, melted ore cooked, illuminated, and encoded a memory as ritual. Fire became both apocalypse and scripture, the trauma and the tool. Humanity's dual identity as builder and destroyer was forged at that intersection. We are the children of conflagration, half creators, half residues of what once burned. The memory of fire also manifests in the structures that endure after collapse. The scorched stones of ancient cities, the vitrified walls of northern forts, the melted sand of desert ruins, all are vitrified chronicles of resets. They remind us that rebuilding always begins in ashes. When we look upon them today, we see not failures but signatures of renewal. The ancients accepted this law existentially. Civilizations are phoenixes, not monuments. Each burns to prove that memory cannot be buried, only transformed. The metaphor of the phoenix, rising immaculate from its pyre, was not born from fantasy but observation. In the calm glow of dawn after catastrophe, survivors saw life insist on returning. Green sprouted through soot, the atmosphere cleared, the stars reappeared. In that resurrection they saw destiny. Fire was the keeper of the threshold, destroying so the next age could ascend freer of distortion. To lose everything was to be reorganized. To burn was to be remembered. When we gaze at our illuminated cities today, reflected in rivers and glass, we are looking into that same paradox. Night, made bright as day, fulfills the ancient prayer to hold the darkness at bay. Yet the brilliance blinds as much as it enlightens. Light pollution erases the stars, the first symbols of orientation, and we find ourselves lost once more. The fire that saved us also severs us from the sky. Our new temples, the cities themselves, burn energy endlessly in reverence to our own reflection, mistaking brightness for understanding. Perhaps the final lesson of the memory of fire is humility. For all our genius, we remain a species defined by our relationship to destruction. We inherit catastrophe as curriculum, learn through ruin, rebuild through loss. Beneath every technological miracle flickers the same pulse that ended the world before. The question is not whether fire will return, but how we will face it. With arrogance it becomes annihilation, with reverence, rebirth. The choice has always been ours, though few have recognized it until the glow was already upon their walls. The ancients left us their memories not to terrify, but to warn. Through myth and monument, they cautioned that the cycles of flood and flame are inseparable. Water erases, fire reminds. To listen to those echoes is to acknowledge that we are temporary custodians of balance. The same divine arithmetic that froze the earth 12 millennia ago and later thawed it still governs us. The universe has one commandment repeated by every element. Remember. Remember the proportion, the humility, the equilibrium. Forget, and the sky will teach it in light once again. Fire is memory transfigured into judgment. It does not forgive, it recalibrates. Civilizations may vanish, but the flame endures, hiding in the mantle, waiting for the next age to dream again of mastery. And when it rises, as it surely must, it will not be vengeance. It will be correction, the cosmic act of reminding. We will call it disaster, apocalypse, the end of history. But the earth will call it by another name, restoration. In its blaze, the circle closes, the great reset completes itself, and from the ashes of our age, the next will inherit the same faint ember, the one we called knowledge, the one we always forget to honor until it burns.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.